Please welcome First Draft US Director, Dr. Claire Wardle.
Welcome everyone to our opening event for Infotheque 2020. Thank you for tuning in, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on wherever you are. We are so grateful today to have Vanita Gupta join us. She is President and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Appointed by President Obama in 2014 to the post of Acting Assistant Attorney General and head of the US Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, she oversaw a wide range of criminal and civil enforcement efforts. Under her leadership, the division did critical work to advance constitutional policing and criminal justice reform, prosecute hate crimes and human trafficking, promote disability rights, protect the rights of LGBTQ individuals, ensure voting rights for all, and combat discrimination in education, housing, employment, lending, and religious exercise. Also happens to be the same age as me. So I have to admit, when I was reading that last night, I was like, oh, I have more to do. But anyway, Vanita, welcome. She's an amazing person doing amazing work. So I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to talk with you. And so my first question is, when we were thinking about people to ask, I was like, I know that Vanita's too busy. So I'm just going to ask you, what does a day in the life of Vanita Gupta look like right now? In the last 2 days, I saw you on Face the Nation. In 6 minutes, you have to watch it. It's a great piece. And then last night I was going to sleep. You'd just written an op-ed in the Washington Post about the change now to the time we have to do door-to-door census work, which is going to disproportionately impact hard-to-reach Americans. So how are you prioritizing everything that's coming across your desk right now?
Well, first of all, Claire, thank you for having me. Thank you for doing this. I think it's critically important. And I want to thank everyone for joining. What is a day in the life? Every day is completely different. I will tell you, the last 3.5 years have been an entirely wild ride for any civil rights advocate. I am the head of the Leadership Conference, as you said. Most people outside of Washington aren't familiar with it. Civilrights.org is our website. We are actually in our 70th year this year. We were founded, just for quick context, by Jewish and African-American labor leaders in 1950, out of the theory that the fight for civil rights needed to be waged in coalition and couldn't be won by one group alone. And for the last 7 decades, we really have been the federal arm of the civil rights movement, pushing and crafting and shepherding all major civil rights legislation, executive actions, and increasingly, because of how federal progress gets made in the United States, supporting state-based campaigns. We've really prioritized in the Trump era the fight for democratic norms and institutions, because for the civil rights community, on everything that we care about, whether it's criminal justice reform, educational equity, immigrants' rights, we cannot preserve rights or advance wins when our democratic institutions, the courts, the census by which political representation and power gets allocated and resources for everything in municipal healthcare, hospitals, schools gets determined, in voting rights. And all three have been distinctly under attack and weaponized in the last several years. And so that is why we've got a very kind of clear focus. And right now you're seeing me talk a lot about the fight to safeguard our elections, both because of the global pandemic, which has put enormous strain, but also with a president who has been intent on kind of weaponizing legitimate voting methods for a host of reasons that I'm sure we will discuss. But mainly for partisan gain. It's been a dangerous time for democratic norms and institutions. It's been a dangerous time for media and journalism as well. And so I have been really squarely focused on these structural democracy issues because they undergird everything else that advances civil rights in this country.
And so, as you know, First Draft focuses on misinformation. And what we know is that misinformation and conspiracies thrive when there is an absence of clear explanations or guidance. And so I'm British. I have to say, I love this country, but we vote with pencils and paper in my country. And it's very hard to understand when every state has different rules. What do journalists, both local and national, have to think about around this problem of systematic voter suppression, much of which comes from confusion and taking advantage of confusion of the different voting laws?
Yeah, I mean, I will say, you know, as I'm talking about structural power and democratic institutions, one of the biggest threats to them is the power of disinformation and misinformation at this moment to basically undermine them. And they are being, you know, all of this is being weaponized as well, both for partisan gain and for longer term kind of exclusion of vulnerable communities. Right now, because of COVID, and many of you saw that in March, states started to postpone primaries because they were unable to, there was a surge. It was, everyone was kind of figuring out what this pandemic was going to look like. And states started to really try to grapple with how to carry out elections amid the pandemic. And you saw images out of Wisconsin and Georgia that were really distressing. People waiting in long lines, hours, in some cases 7 and 8 hours, trying to social distance in these lines, much as always, heavily hit in Black and brown communities and higher density neighborhoods, urban communities. And states now in a position where they have to change the rules to be able to hold an election in November amid the pandemic. States are making a lot of rules changes. They are increasingly trying to put in place vote by mail systems, the mail-in ballots that the president has been kind of undermining, but a very legitimate method and used almost exclusively in several states for many years. 5 states have been using the kind of mail-in ballot method for quite some time and without, any major scandals or glitches. And those are Colorado, Hawaii, Oregon, Washington, and Utah. And they are needing, though, to also preserve, and this is important for reporters to understand because there's kind of an over correction and pushing and looking only exclusively to mail-in ballots as the answer to voting in a pandemic. The reality is that for a lot of vulnerable voters, the states actually need to preserve in-person voting. And so there's been a push by the Leadership Conference and many others to expand early in-person voting because communities like voters with disabilities, Native American communities in many places do not have access to the US Postal Service. You have voters of color, African American voters, older, who have historical concerns around problems and historical problems with vote by mail or don't trust the US Postal Service. And so you've got to be able to preserve in-person voting. And so states, there's been a push to expand it and then expand online voter registration systems right now because government agencies where people tend to go are right now closed. Just to provide some context, Claire, you are also witnessing in the United States an attack on the US Postal Service. The president put in a donor to help oversee it. Several weeks ago, he has now made cuts in the kind of name of budget cutting that is causing days of delays in how the US Postal Service is able to operate. And you have postal workers and leaders now expressing pretty grave alarm about the ability to be able to carry out the election in an election that's going to be very heavily, mail voting. And so there's a push for states to actually, more and more states need to adopt a rule that says any ballot that arrives on or before Election Day must be counted, or within a reasonable period of 15 days. And some states have made that rule. But there are still too many states that require the receipt by Election Day, which means a lot of people could end up being disenfranchised. So these are some of the real challenges that states are facing in this moment that reporters, there's been a lot of focus on what happens around the calling of the election November 3rd, and I want to talk about that, but there's actually a breadth and depth of stories to be writing right now about voter suppression right now, and disinformation and misinformation is going to be key. This is a lot of rules changes for voters. 1 in 4 voters in 2016 voted by mail. So this requires voters being educated as to the real facts about how they can fill in the ballots, and it looks different, as you said, in state to state. But vote.org is a great resource. It breaks down exactly what the rules are in every state, and individual voters can check it, reporters can check it. But the power in this moment of disinformation to confuse voters, to sow fear about voting amid COVID. You can imagine November 1st, suddenly a politician or a candidate saying COVID is raging in Milwaukee and Detroit, do not do in-person voting. This goes viral at a time where it's too late to apply for absentee ballot. You can see how people will be disenfranchised in that moment. There's concern about, you could have viral postings or misinformation talking about how the National Guard or ICE is going to be outside of certain polling stations that could result in voter suppression. So all of this is actually being laid right now. And it's why I'm talking directly to Mark Zuckerberg and to other social media companies at this moment, because they play a crucial role, and all of you do as well, in trying to distinguish the lies from the truth and the facts, and making sure that voters actually are not being preyed upon and having their vote suppressed or their participation chilled because of active campaigns that we know already exist to misinform and disinform.
That's great. And there's so much academic research about this power of inoculation that if we actually talk to voters ahead of time about what they might see and what are the motivations of these people that are pushing those narratives, which is essentially voter suppression, that actually people are much more likely to identify something as misinformation. It's like, oh yeah, I was told that I was probably going to see an image of ICE at the voting. That's really what we should be doing. But also, you're right, this is a time for explainers from journalists to say, this is how you can vote, and this is our experience of how it's secure. So you touched, oh yeah, Vanita. Go.
No, go ahead.
Well, I should say you touched on this, but I think we were both talking about Ben Smith's column in the New York Times yesterday. If you haven't read it, I would really recommend it, everybody. It's called How the Media Could Get the Election Story Wrong. It's time to rethink election night. And he's basically saying, newsrooms and platforms just aren't prepared for how different the evening of November 3rd is going to look in comparison to previous election nights. And so, Vanita, what message would you like participants to take back to their newsrooms as these conversations start happening about how to plan for election night?
Yeah. My hope is that all of you will write stories now about how we are not going to know the results of this election on November 3rd, and that is democracy working amid an election during a pandemic. And to reassure and educate voters, the media, politicians, that it is entirely appropriate when we will be going from states like New York that on the midterms voted, I think 4 or 5% of New Yorkers voted by mail. In this next election, folks are anticipating potentially 60, 70% of New Yorker voters voting by mail. And this is just an example. The secretaries of states all run their own elections, and they need to be given the time to count the ballots and then certify their election. And it won't happen in this election on November 3rd. And the instinct and impulse to call breaking news and the anxiety, especially during as politically polarized a time where people feel like everything is at stake in this election, it's going to be a real challenge. And the media, which we live in a breaking news addicted media and public, it's just, folks need to be patient. In the Wisconsin primary, as chaotic as it was, they also did take a week to count the ballots. There are a number of states. There's also going to be litigation. So absentee ballots tend to be rejected at a higher rate by voters of color. There's all kinds of studies that show this. So there is going to also be litigation. I hope that it'll be a question of days before each secretary of state can certify the election. I will tell you, there will be candidates that will attack local and state election officials for doing their job and holding this. My hope is that the media, social and otherwise, is going to do what it can to break through those threats and to understand, again, that this is democracy at work. But you're going to need stories. So you need to be thinking in advance of how are you filling the space between people voting? And there's going to be an overemphasis, because there always is, on in-person voting. But if the media starts to make overestimates based on in-person voting, when in some places the majority of people will be voting by mail, that will be a problem as well. You need absentee ballots counted, you need provisional ballots counted, and this will be an election unlike any other. And so really kind of thinking about that, there's going to be a lot of allegations of fraud. There's already efforts to sow the seeds for delegitimizing both valid voting methods, but also delegitimizing the election should Trump lose. And so we have to be, as you said, inoculating in advance and educating people in advance about this so that we are ready come the night, and the expectations are all clear and shared that we're going to need to wait, and we're going to need to be a little patient before we can actually know if we're actually going to count everyone's vote.
Yeah, because so much of this is going to be about who controls the narrative. And I remember in 2000 when the media called Florida for Bush, and 2 hours later they retracted it. But that allowed a framing for the following 36 days to say that Gore was a sore loser. And 2000 feels like a very, very different time to compare to now. And so this question will be who controls the narrative. And so I want to shift gears slightly, but it's definitely the same ballpark, which is let's think about the social platforms. Because if I wanted to control the narrative in 2020, It's how do I use social media to push my narratives? And so obviously you were involved with a number of other civil rights organizations. You're talking to Mark Zuckerberg and some other leaders. And as many of you know, earlier this month, a law firm published a civil rights audit of Facebook. It took them 2 years to complete. So Vanita, did you think that audit went far enough? Is there anything that journalists can do to continue to put pressure on the platforms to really help people understand the scale of the problem? Because unfortunately, an op-ed, the Washington Post or the New York Times can sometimes be the thing that pushes the needle and makes change happen in Silicon Valley. So anything that journalists can do to help here?
Yeah, my answer is yes, please. So the Leadership Conference has been involved in pushing Facebook, especially in the area of voting and elections, and also for us, the census, because disinformation on these issues can be devastating. And we are not satisfied with where Facebook has ended up yet. And the civil rights audit is something that the Leadership Conference and other civil rights groups have been pushing for some time. We were very heavily involved with it for the last, for its duration. And the report is very hard hitting. I would urge all of you to take a look, even just at the intro, which is a very hard hitting introduction. But the work specifically, we were able, I will say, through this audit to get maybe the most robust disinformation policy around the census back in December of last year with Facebook, and we've been working with Twitter and Google as well. But the voting piece is still is the real point of strain. So at our urging, Mark Zuckerberg announced last month or several weeks ago, I can't remember, but that he was creating a voter information center that would be put up on any and all voting related posts so that it would provide both inoculation for misinformation, but also provide information and be a source of accurate information. My concern is that that's good, it's important, but they are failing to police disinformation and voter suppression, even within the four corners of the policy that the civil rights community helped work with them on. And so when the president put up misinformation about voting methods in Michigan and Nevada back in May, when Twitter took it down, or actually labeled it, Facebook took no action. And so we are continuing to press Mark using very specific examples and really trying to help him and his team. They are not civil rights experts. They should have civil rights expertise in their C-suite now and on their senior team, but to understand exactly what voter suppression looks like online, and that it isn't, you don't have to be able to prove that this post caused these 4 voters to not vote or not have their vote counted, that it is actually about information that creates that intimidates voters, that causes them to sit it out, that builds up a culture around this in the lead up to an election. And we have seen the role that Facebook has played in promoting authoritarian regimes in elections in Myanmar and the Philippines and the like. And to learn from this and not let it happen, we also are very concerned about the possibility of incitement of violence. When Facebook left up the looters and shooters post, and we are anticipating that come November 3rd, in the void of an election that will be able to be immediately called, there's a lot of agitation in this country all around these issues, and people are going to be potentially inciting violence. There's white supremacy violence. There's been armed protesters showing up, threatening the Michigan governor, for example, most recently. What is the role of the social media companies to actually take action, pursue it? I'm not even asking for a new policy at this point. I'm saying enforce the policy that you have on the books. And Mark has been justifying doing all this in the name of free expression without recognizing that voting is free expression in America and in democracy. And that just to kind of, glorify politicians' speech. Politicians are the primary perpetrators of voter suppression in this country. And so if you're going to have a voter suppression policy in the books, you've got to be able to police it. It isn't enough to just put this post up around the Voter Information Center for any and all voting. You're not indicating to the user or making a judgment call according to your own community standards about labeling and identifying misinformation. I think it's really important for the media to be calling this out, but also to be calling lies lies, and to not be afraid of denouncing these lies when they happen, and to be able to prove, you know, through factually. And a lot of this I see happily going on now around the kind of myth of voter fraud. But I think that this ongoing need to really push the social media companies to do more to police this stuff is important. I've been heartened to see Twitter taking more action, but then we've got to keep the pressure on.
Yeah, and with my research background, I want to keep seeing these changes happen, but I want us to be researching it, because we know so little about what the impact is of this kind of speech and what the impact is of taking action. The last set of questions I want to talk to you about is about this relationship between journalism and advocacy, because there has been this kind of traditional mistrust, I think, between advocacy groups and journalists, with a feeling that from the advocacy groups that many newsrooms, let's just be honest for a second, often don't necessarily reflect the communities that they're telling stories about. So there's been some hurt feelings about stories that have done damage to communities. Then on the other side, we have journalists saying, well, I know I should be working with advocacy groups, but I feel like I shouldn't do that as a journalist. I mean, what are your thoughts here as we're facing this particular moment? We've just gone through 2 to 3 months where many newsrooms are looking at their policies around diversity, thinking about how they can tell stories differently. Are there ways that we can improve the relationships between advocacy groups and newsrooms?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think this is when I was saying that, you know, the Facebook senior team are not civil rights experts. A lot of folks in the media are not civil rights experts. I'm not a journalist. Like, I understand the role that I play. I am, though, a nonpartisan civil rights expert and voting rights expert. And there are many of us in the nonpartisan space. This has been a really a thing that gets under my skin a lot, and Facebook made this mistake too, and they sometimes continue to. But this notion that civil rights and voting rights is somehow partisan, that it's like the Democratic Party versus, and so you've got this moral equivalence between, you know, if you're going to talk to a civil rights advocate, you have to talk to a conservative. No, actually, we have laws on the books in this country that are civil rights laws that everyone is supposed to protect. And I do the work that I do as a member of a nonpartisan organization. And so it is a mistake to not rely on voting rights experts to inform your stories, your pieces. I would urge you, I think we have a lot of stories. We should be also on our end doing a better job of giving you information, feeding those stories. People don't understand. They think voter suppression is this made up thing by the civil rights community or by the Democratic Party. But actually there are profound stories of how people have had their vote suppressed, how the lengths to which people have gone to actually try to vote, you know, in Milwaukee in April, or, you know, and we should be telling some of these stories, but also talking about humanizing what voter suppression looks like. And I would urge you, we are sitting on a lot of data. There are organizations like the Lawyers Committee, which runs a big election protection program that has a lot of data and stories. The Leadership Conference actually has a campaign. We have 2 campaigns. One is All Voting is Local, which is, we have staff in Wisconsin, Georgia, Nevada, Michigan, Ohio, Florida, Pennsylvania, I'm forgetting one, Arizona, working with local and state election officials on a myriad of voting problems, because after the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013, it really left this void of the ability to solve problems at the local level. Things like rolling out new machines, re-registering purged voters, you know, working to ensure poll worker recruitment, because that's another big issue now amid COVID. Most of our poll workers are retirees. In order to have early voting and expanded early voting, we have to have younger people serving as poll workers. So trying to fix a whole myriad of problems. You know, I can connect you, Claire, and I'm happy to connect reporters to different people doing different things, Native American organizations that are really struggling in this moment about how to ensure participation, given the kind of rural and remoteness of some of their communities, voters with disabilities. So there's the expertise is here, and the need to kind of provide that connectivity in a way that is not going to be about one party or another, but truly about trying to ensure that in 2020 in the United States of America, in these unprecedented circumstances where you can have, misinformation, disinformation go viral, global pandemic, racial unrest, polarized, and candidates willing to prey on, racism as an electoral tactic. We've got to rely on each other to be able to tell the real stories. And so, again, I'm happy to be a resource. There are so many of us out there doing this work, but really working to ensure not only that everyone who is eligible can vote, but actually will have their vote counted, and that we will have an election where the results are legitimate and seen as legitimate by the eyes, not only of people here in the United States, but around the world.
And just finally, we're less than 100 days away from the election. I'm trying not to be really depressed. Do you think we have time to prepare? Everything you've said has been extraordinary, but I'm like, oh, that's a long to-do list. Just how are you feeling?
I'm actually, so maybe because I was caught so flat-footed without any prep in 2016, look, I wish we had everything in place and all the states had the rules changes in place 5 months ago, but I do think that we have time. I think it's significant that First Draft is having this conversation now, that the media is really beginning to talk about these issues now. We have a lot of work to do. I would urge everyone, though, not just to look at or to think about November 3rd. Early voting actually is going to start in September in many places around the country, or the application for absentee ballots. So what we do and report now is going to have tremendous impact on fighting misinformation and disinformation come November 3rd and beyond. And I look at this as an election season. This is not going to be an election night, but the season has already started. So I am hopeful. I think more people in America are focused on fighting for our democracy and trying to understand voting, trying to understand the impact of the census than ever before. We saw that in the results in the 2018 midterms around the participation in ballot initiatives, democracy reform ballot initiatives. Democracy reform used to be like this super wonky, abstract, nobody cared kind of thing. But people are beginning to understand how this all kind of relates. And I think for reporters to be able to highlight and work on these issues now, this is not too late. This is the time. We need this now more than ever.
Thank you so much. I think we needed that pep talk. Thank you so much, Vanita. I'm sure you're off to do another million things, but thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Appreciate it.